Well, we've looked at the science. Now what about the policy response? The Gillard government's carbon tax will put a $23 a tonne price on CO2 emissions from around 300 of the country's biggest emitters. They will then pass on that cost to their customers and clients. One of the big concerns has been, are we getting ahead of the rest of the world with this particular policy? The European price is closer to or under, I think, $10 a tonne. The US doesn't have any price on carbon, nor does China or Japan or Canada. Assistant Treasurer David Bradbury, who is ahead of us if we're not ahead of the rest of the world?
Well, I think if you have a look at the OECD, you're talking about more than 90% of the OECD nations either have a nationwide ETS or a state or provincial-based system that's in operation. So we're not the first ones to be going down this path, and I think it's important to put this in the context of the debate that we've been having in this country for many years. I think the significant point that I would make is that pricing carbon, attaching a cost to it and making polluters pay for the damage that they are doing to the environment is ultimately the cheapest and the most effective way of driving behavioural change within the economy.
I want to get to that behavioural change, but this path that, as you point out, other countries are on, are any, though, as far down the path as we now are with a $23 nationwide price?
Well, look, we often hear the opposition talk about economy-wide, and it's important to recognise that there are sectors within our economy that are not brought within the scheme. So it's not always true to call it an economy-wide scheme. But certainly at the $23 a tonne mark, there are other schemes that are in place that have higher amounts in terms of the price on carbon.
And they are?
Well, if you look, no two schemes are the same, and it's important to recognise that. So you look at particularly some of the Scandinavian countries, the schemes that they have in place that in some cases might be more narrowly based, in others are still reasonably broadly based, but they do have a price on carbon that in some cases is considerably more than the $23 per tonne.
Greg Hunt, do you accept that there are other countries perhaps where we are on this path?
No. The Productivity Commission to which David referred set out very clearly that there is no other country in the world which has an economy-wide carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. What do we actually have in Europe? We have a situation where there is a low price and a thin base. In Australia we have a high price and a broad base. And the best example of that is in the first 5 years of the European scheme, they raised about $500 million a year on average.
Across Europe?
Across Europe. Across a population of 500 million. So that's about $1 per person per year. In Australia, in the first year alone, we're looking at $8.5 billion. It will average $9 billion over each of the first 4 years for a population of just over 22 million.
A lot of that money is going back into compensation, though, isn't it, to business and to households?
We're talking about the difference between raising $1 per person and $400 per person. In the United States, no carbon tax. In Canada, they've just had an election. Definitely no carbon tax. In Japan, deferred indefinitely. In Korea, it's been put back. And in China, there are a couple of pilot state schemes, or actually city-based schemes, but nothing like the government says. And in India, no prospect. So the reality is there is nothing like the Australian scheme anywhere in the world.
Professor Will Steffen, you've looked a lot at what else has been happening around the world. How would you describe where Australia is at?
Well, I like to compare it to some of the statistics that the OECD has, because that's where we fit. And it's interesting that the thing we're interested in scientists is how much emission reduction you get compared to the economic growth that you have, or lack of economic growth. And it's interesting that if you look at the OECD countries for the last decade, or at least from 2000 to 2008, the country that's achieved the most emission reduction is Sweden, not surprisingly, one of the Scandinavian countries that you mentioned, David. And it's interesting that over the same period, it had higher economic growth than the USA, Canada, UK, Germany, France and Italy. All the big OECD economies. And I had the pleasure actually of living there. They have over $100 a tonne price on carbon on parts of their economy. Yeah, you felt it a bit. But Swedes are very creative and they're very innovative.
But are they a resource-rich country that relies on cheap electricity like Australia?
They're resource-rich in different ways. they have hydropower, and they have a big forestry industry. And they have some nuclear power. So each country has a different mix that it works with. But the interesting thing is when you look at the entire economy of Sweden, it actually outperformed those big six in the OECDs over precisely the period that it was reducing its emissions more than those big six. So as a scientist, I don't want to get into the policies of how they did that. But as a scientist, what I'm interested in is we've got to start getting emissions down around the world in countries that have all sorts of different schemes. So I think it's useful just to look around the world and see who's doing what. And as a scientist, look at the evidence.
Tim,
what have they achieved at what cost to the economy or benefit to the economy?
Tim Wilson, you've recently come back from the Rio +20 talks where this, amongst other issues, was being discussed. Where do you think Australia fits? I mean, are we simply keeping up with what others are doing?
Well, no, we're way ahead of the rest of the world, and the analogy Greg just used about broadest and highest imposed tax for the broadest application of a carbon tax puts us way above the rest of the world, and he's spot on. But you just need to look at what's happening, as you outlined before, in terms of the different countries, and what we're seeing is nowhere near the same level of action, and particularly I think China's really interesting. It's all tied into international negotiations on climate change policy because there's so much incentive for countries to cheat if other countries don't take on the same obligations or to free ride. And what we're seeing in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is policy paralysis. At the Rio +20 summit I was at only last week, the week before, 53-page policy document on sustainable development, 3 paragraphs were about climate change. Internationally, there is no movement towards a binding agreement. In fact, the Australian government is not even going to ratify the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. That's how little motion and momentum there is towards cutting greenhouse gas emissions and being bound by it. And if countries aren't bound by it and don't have binding targets, then you won't get the emissions reduction you need to bring us onto a level of comparison to the rest of the world.
Adam Band, the biggest economy in the world is the United States, and it will be for a while anyway. Where's the momentum there for a price on carbon?
I think you've got to go back to basics and work out and remember why we're doing this in the first place. We're doing this in the first place because for the last 200 years we thought that you could put pollution into the atmosphere for free and that it wouldn't cost anything. And what we're now finding is that it's got enormous costs, and costs now and into the future, where Ross Garnaut tells us if we don't get climate change under control, we can look towards a 92% decline in productivity in the Murray-Darling Basin. And we're going to... Nick Stern says 10 to 20% of GDP for just dealing with it. So
it's a global problem, though.
It is, but the real question is, what's the appropriate price to put on that pollution to start making the shift away from polluting energy to others? Now, in Germany, one of the countries that was referred to in the Productivity Commission, they said, well, they're 20% renewables last year. They've got 382,000 jobs in the sector. Their GDP is going up while their energy use is going down. But the Productivity Commission says it's costing them somewhere around $100, $120 per tonne of pollution abatement. And we're here talking about $25. And even $25, I don't think, $23 is enough to drive the transition even away from coal to gas.
What should it be?
Well, we've heard that in other countries where they've had this for a while, it's getting up substantially higher than that. We need a mix. I don't think $23 is going to be enough. It'll eventually have to go up if we're to make that shift.
To make that shift from coal to gas, it needs to be like $50,
Well, we've got to come back to why we're doing this. And if one of the reasons that we're doing this is to say, well, we want an economy that's not based on pollution, then everything else flows from there. And I think that's one of the problems that Tony Abbott hasn't been called on, is that does he want an economy based on pollution?
We'll get to their alternative, Tim.
Adam has hit on a really important point, which is you can tax yourself out of the use of certain types of technologies in, say, the energy sector, but you need a technology that can replace it, that provides base load power so that we can all have the energy we need with lower emissions. And yes, if you want to get from coal to gas, and gas has an emissions profile of about half of coal for simple sake, you need a tax of somewhere around $50 to $70. If you actually want to go to other types of technologies which can provide base load power, if assuming we're excluding nuclear, and I'm assuming Adam's going to continue to exclude that, you need to go into the many hundreds of dollars. So Adam's absolutely right. $23 won't cut it. If you want to do it, you have to increase it into the many hundreds of dollars, and that raises serious issues around political sustainability of this tax, particularly while other countries aren't taking anywhere near the same proportionate amount of action and imposing anywhere near the same proportionate amount of cost. And if you go down this path, what you'll end up having is a tax which destroys the economy over the long run if you continue to increase it without other countries taking the same action. And this idea that you can just change everything into clean energy is just false without the technology.
Well,
the technology is the problem, Adam.
Yeah. It's just not right. Well, let's talk about technology. Let's look at the country in the European Union at the moment that is a shining light, Germany. 382,000 jobs in renewable energy. Last year, 20% of their electricity came from renewables. This was... they're phasing out nuclear. They're phasing out their coal plants eventually. They're getting there. And their economy is going gangbusters.
What's wrong with the German example?
Well, because they take an enormous amount of their power from France, which relies on nuclear energy.
That's last year, during the European cold snap, France, with all its nuclear reactors, actually ran out of energy, and Germany had to send some down the interconnector into France.
The irony is that the policies that actually drive the adoption of things like wind farms, like here as well, actually isn't carbon pricing. It's direct action policies that are extremely expensive in countries like Germany. And so suggesting this is somehow a result of carbon pricing is fundamentally false. And yes, you might get wind turbines if you spend enormous amounts of taxpayers' money, but in the process of doing that, you lumber households with significant costs, and it doesn't provide the base load energy, and you need to replicate it. There's serious questions around the environmental benefit when you need to have X number of wind turbines just to replicate the energy capacity of, say, for instance, one coal-fired or one nuclear power station.
Anna Rose, let me ask you about this, the international comparisons.
You guys are talking about how much it costs to act on climate change. But the question is, if we don't act on climate change, how much is it going to cost us? How much is it going to cost young Australians? The impacts on our health and our economy and our infrastructure are absolutely enormous, much more than $23 a tonne. And Tim, I was in Rio, and you're not telling the full story. The full story is that most of the world is acting on climate change. You mentioned Canada. British Columbia has a carbon price of over $28 a tonne. Most of the world have taken steps already to act on climate change, and they look at Australia and say, you guys complaining about a $23 a tonne is a joke. Well, because we know we have to act on climate change. It's much more expensive to not act on. I mean, what's the alternative? Just to ignore it, bury our heads in the sand and pretend it's not a problem?
Tim, we'll come back to you, but Professor Poltridge, what do you think about where we sit internationally with this sort of stuff?
You raised a good point. Why are we in this business of trying to reduce the carbon dioxide output or input to the atmosphere? You remember Professor Garneau a few years ago, who produced a series of reports for the government on what Australia should do and why it should do it. And he calculated that, as far as Australia is concerned, because of the reduction of rainfall that was predicted by some of these climate models, then the average standard of living of the average Australian would go down by 10% below that which it would have been otherwise after 100 years. Now, we won't go into the science of whether or not the prediction of a drier southeastern Australia was correct or not. I mean, it's more or less guesswork, but let's assume that he was correct. He also let it be known that, according to his calculations, if there was no climate change, the average standard of living of the average Australian in 100 years' time would be 400%, 4 times what it is now. Which means that if you believe that Australian standard of living will be reduced by 10% because of a change in climate, in effect, what we're being asked to do is to put our hands in our pockets now and give it to the future generations 100 years ahead, and you're giving money to people who are 3.5 times wealthier than we are. All right, I find that very strange.
We are going to have to take another break, but I do want to look at exactly what this is going to cost Australian households and business. Stay with us.